Hello student, in this session let us learn what are the desirable properties or the requirement of aggregates to be used in the road construction work, and also will brief out the various tests which are conducted to determine the properties of aggregate and the recommendation given by IRC for its suitability will be discussed in this session. Some of the desirable properties of aggregates include the first and foremost basic property is the strength. The aggregates that are used in the road construction work should be strong enough to withstand the stresses due to the traffic and wheel load. Aggregates, especially which are used in the top layers, for example, either in the wearing cores, should be capable of withstanding the high stresses in addition to the wear and tear. And the aggregates what we use that should possess sufficient resistance to crushing. The second desirable property is hardness. So the aggregates used in the pavement surface courses should withstand the high magnitude of wheel load stresses and also the wear and tear. Hence the aggregate should have a resistance to abrasion caused by the traffic movement, or it should possess the hardness property. The aggregate should also have a resistance from getting polished or getting smoothened under the traffic movement in order to prevent pavement surface becoming too slippery, especially under the wet climatic conditions. The next property is the aggregates that are used in the road construction work should possess sufficient toughness. Why is this? The aggregates in the pavement are subjected to impact due to the moving wheel loads, and the severe impacts will be caused on, especially when you have a road like WBM roads. The magnitude of the impacts that are caused will depend upon the roughness of the road surface. If the road consisting of more uneven, the impact caused on the road will be more. Therefore, the aggregates that are used in the road construction work should possess sufficient resistance to impact, or it has to possess the impact property. The aggregates that are the next property is the shape of the aggregates. So we know that aggregates possess the various shape. The aggregates can be rounded, the aggregates can be angular, okay, or the aggregates can be flaky, or aggregates can be elongated. So these are all the various shape of the aggregates that are possible. So now which is suitable for the road construction work? So generally it says that too flaky and too elongate aggregates are not recommended in the road construction work, because there are chances that when use of flaky and aggregate elongated, the aggregates may get crushed under the roller during the compaction, or they may even break down under the heavy wheel traffic. Hence, generally we prefer usage of angular aggregates in the road construction work. The next property is the property of aggregates to adhere with the bitumen. Why it is important? Especially when you make the bituminous mixes, the aggregates what we use that should have sufficient affinity towards the bitumen. When the bituminous mixes are prepared, the bitumen will form a thin layer of coating around the aggregates. If the aggregate doesn't possess the sufficient affinity with the bitumen, there are chances that bitumen may get stripped out of the aggregate, especially in the presence of water. Also, the chemical properties and the surface chemistry of the aggregates play a very important role in the performance of the bituminous mixes. The next property is the durability. Yes, we know that all the materials that we use in the road construction work must be durable. So here also the aggregates that we use that must be durable. It should not undergo any change in the physical or chemical property due to the weathering action or when it is exposed to the climatic condition. And at last, the aggregates that we use in the road construction work must be free from deleterious particle. So it means to say that a specification for aggregates used in the bituminous mixes, usually we require aggregates to be clean, tough and durable in nature, and it should be free from excess amount of flaky and elongated pieces. And also when it comes to the fine aggregate, it must be free from dust or clay lumps and other objectionable material. Now the question is, we have to assess whether the given aggregate possess these desirable property or not. To test that, we have the various tests on aggregate such that we can decide the suitability of aggregate for the use in pavement construction work. The sum of the tests that are conducted on the aggregate to determine the properties of the aggregates are crushing. The first one is the crushing test. So this will determine the aggregate strength, and next we have the abrasion test which determine the hardness of the aggregate, impact test which determines the toughness property of the aggregate, soundness is designed to determine the durability, and next the shape test which will determine the shape of the aggregate, and specific gravity and the water absorption is another important parameters when we take the aggregates. And last one is the bitumen adhesion test, so which will determine the adhesion property of aggregates with the bitumen. So in this session anyways we'll not going in detail about the testing procedure, that will be done on the separate classes. So we'll look into the specifications, what is to be required to fulfill the suitability as a road aggregate. So the first test is the aggregate testing. So all these test procedure what we been recommended, all these are as per the IS specification, and the recommendation for the various properties of aggregates or the requirement of aggregates will be given by the IRC or MORTH specification. The first is the crushing test. We will test the aggregate for the aggregate crushing value using the crushing test, which will determine the strength of the aggregate. So as the test result, if you get the less than 10%, it signifies that aggregates are strong, and while above 35% normally regarded as a weak aggregates, and the aggregates with the aggregate crushing value above 35 percentage are not recommended in the pavement construction work. Similarly, for the impact value, if impact test will determine the toughness of the aggregates. So IRC recommend that the aggregates with the impact value less than 30% can be used in the wearing courses, I mean to say in the top layers, whereas the value up to 35% can be utilized in the bituminous macadam layers, and for up to 40% aggregate with impact value up to 40% are recommended in the waterborne macadam or base course layers, and the aggregates with impact value exceeding 40% are not recommended in the. And here also when we test the aggregate crushing test and impact test, we have to select the aggregates passing 12.5 mm down and which is retained on the 10 mm down. Such aggregates are tested and we will have to determine what is the aggregate crushing value and the impact construction work. The next test is the abrasion test. Abrasion test will determine the hardness property of the aggregates. So we generally use Los Angeles abrasion testing machine to determine the abrasion value of an aggregate. So similar to the impact value, aggregate abrasion value up to 35% are recommended in the bituminous concrete construction work, and aggregates abrasion value up to 40% are recommended for the WBM base courses, whereas if the abrasion value exceeds 40%, such aggregates are not recommended in the road construction work. So when we test the abrasion test, we have to adhere to these gradation specified by the IS value. And here when we do the abrasion test, we have to adhere to the gradation requirement as per the table given. The next is the shape test, which will determine the flakiness index and elongation index of the aggregates. We usually use elongation index is determined using length gauge, and flakiness index is determined using the thickness gauge. So when we test the aggregate for flakiness index and elongation index, it should be noted that for the bituminous concrete or surfacing courses, the value should not exceed 25%. So here you have to note that it is not just the value of flakiness index or elongation index. So these value what is recommended, that we generally call it as the combined index. Okay, the combined index are nothing but the sum of flakiness index plus elongation index. Calculate what the flakiness index value for the given aggregates and elongation index separately, then add the value you have obtained to get the combined index. Calculate the combined index and then check for the suitability. The aggregates with the combined index within 25% are recommended for the bituminous concrete and surface dressing, whereas the value for waterbound macadam layer that should not exceed 15%. And similarly, when we use it for the wet mix macadam or dense bituminous macadam layers and bituminous concrete courses, the combined value should not exceed 30%. The next property is the specific gravity and the water absorption test. So for aggregates, specific gravity and water absorption tests can be determined using the pyconometer method or the wire basket method. So when we tested using wire basket method or any of the pyconometer method, the value of the specific gravity of aggregate should lie in between the 2.6 to 2.9. Such aggregates with specific gravity within this range are sound enough and are recommended for the road construction work. And similarly, the water absorption value must not exceed 0.6% for the aggregates used in the road construction work. The next is the bitumen adhesion test. So here we have to check whether the given aggregate possess sufficient affinity towards the bitumen, and also we have to check that the bitumen will not get stripped off in presence of water. So for that purpose we can go use the static immersion test as specified by the IRC, which is a quite simple method to determine the bitumen adhesion test. So here the principle is very simple. Aggregate which are coated with the bitumen has to be immersed in water for about 24 hours at a temperature of 40 degrees centigrade, and after 24 hours remove the aggregates from the water and visually examine if any bitumen is stripped out of the aggregate. So then we have to determine, we will express the aggregate stripping value as the ratio of area of bitumen which is stripped out to the total surface area of the aggregates. And the value, stripping value what we have obtained, that should not exceed 5% for the aggregates to be used in the construction work. The last test is the soundness test on the aggregates. The soundness test will determine the durability of the aggregates. So aggregates are subjected to the alternate wetting and drying cycles. So when aggregates are subjected to such alternate wetting and drying cycle, there should not be any loss in weight of the aggregate. So to assess that whether the given aggregate possesses sufficient sufficient resistance towards this alternate wetting and drying cycle, we have soundness test. So for this purpose, again the experiment is work with a simple procedure. So aggregates are subjected to the cycles of alternate wetting and drying condition in the saturated solution of either sodium sulfate or magnesium sulfate for a duration of 16 to 18 hours, and then it is oven dried. So such cycles are repeated for 5 times, and after the fifth cycle you have to determine the loss in weight of the aggregates. So how to determine? Take down the initial weight of the aggregate before the commencement of alternate wetting and drying cycle, and after the 5th cycle once you dry the aggregates in the oven, take down the weight again, which will, the difference in weight will gives you the loss in weight of the aggregate. So the loss, IRC recommended that the loss in weight of aggregate should not exceed 12% when it is tested with the sodium sulfate, and it should not exceed 18% when the aggregates are tested with the magnesium sulfate. So these are the some of the tests which are used to determine the property of the aggregate. So before we use any aggregates in the road construction work, we have to check for its suitability. If it fulfills the requirement given by MORTH or IRC specification, only then the given aggregates can be used in the road construction work. Thank you.